Welcome to Fontribute, where we talk about fonts and their attributes. Fontribute. And today, this week, we have a interesting direction to go with. So this is probably a genre of typefaces or fonts that if I was teaching my Type 1 and Type 2 classes, my instinct would be instant to yell at them about them. Like, why are you doing this? Why are you picking these fonts for this project? But I chose two typefaces in this genre, and I'm talking about the handwriting genre of fonts. I saw these two releases come out, and I figured it'd be a good discussion of what are the attributes of what we call handwriting, and how these two different typefaces take different approaches of this concept of handwriting. Okay, so we have Manu from Typotheque, and we have Marigny from Type Supply. So let's get started for these two. So the first note that should be stated is one is serif and one is sans serif. That's kind of the most obvious things we can see, right? Serifs versus no serifs. That's a pretty direct one. There's some other things we can also pretty quickly identify. One is that this Manu is generally lower in contrast versus the higher contrast of Marigny on the right. And lastly, the approach of the stroke construction. So Manu has this very abrupt style. You can see where the joint of the shoulder going into the stem, it's pretty high up, and it's a really abrupt motion over here, over in this quadrant. Marigny, on the other hand, it would seem as if like the stroke went down, came up and around, and arched back over. Notice the kind of smoothness and more kind of longer time it takes for the strokes to construct in Marigny. So this gives a much more kind of smoothing tone and voice behind it compared to Manu in general. When we get to the O, now it's started seeing some things, but now in O I can really talk about some more aspects of their approaches. So Manu is much more irregular. We can see that by this little indentation. It would give this impression as if the stroke was one motion and didn't complete itself, while Marigny is much more typographic. We can see it feels like there's no clear identifier of the stroke construction of this O, while Manu does. We can also see the nature of weight distribution is much more irregular in Manu. It doesn't follow a consistent stress angle, for example, while Marigny does. It's very straightforward. It's very like a vertical stress in this case for Marigny versus Manu. Also, just the contour proportion. I mean, you can tell. Like, look at this outside counter. It feels like an oval that's leaning more towards 3 o'clock and let's see, 6, 7, no, 8 o'clock. Like 8 o'clock. You feel it leaning over to that side. Well, Manu is much more. Well, it's balanced basically. It's much more a balanced form overall as a shape. And to the A, we can see some other things. We can also signify some other points. One is, again, this nature of abruptness versus smooth transition. Looking at Manu, notice a very abrupt motion here and here. And even also you can see in the counter. Do you see how inside the counter, notice how it feels like the stroke is starting to arch over sooner than where this part ends? And also just kind of this squareness right here and this curved profile over here. And this treatment of the terminal of the A. These all feel very abrupt. And there's this kind of clanky tension where the arching over here smooth comes in this way, and then the stroke comes over this way. And then all the weight distribution, this is heavier over here than over here, for example. It's much more variant. And as a shape too, so as well, the O was going kind of in this direction, right, kind of lopping over that way. This one is going the opposite. Basically, it's leaning this way. It's kind of leaning over to the side and kind of sprawling out in the bottom section over here. Marigny is much more straightforward. You can actually, what's interestingly see this from the stem. So this stroke comes from over here, comes up and around, and then stops. And that's what it feels like. And then the and then it continues over to here. So it's almost like one stroke construction where it went like that. Compare that to this one's following what you would expect more. Compare that. The construction of the form is very different. And one feels very smooth and gradual in its motions, especially in this arching over here, versus the abruptness of this jointing over here in the arch. Into the capitals, we can see some other points. So one is the serifs are directional in Manu. So they're generally leaning more towards the right side. They will emphasize the directionalness in that way. Some cases more than others. As you can tell, this serif is more equal just in proportion, while the other ones are much more dramatic in their alignment of the serifs. Also, we can see a tapering here where the stroke is not perfectly straight. There's a taper here to here, and it flares back out. Same process over here. And then the crossbar has this arching up effect. It arches up. So again, it gives this kind of rushed quickness, speed, momentum in the stroke construction because of that. Also, just a general sense, looks like it feels like a horizontal stress, like the serifs are heavier than the stems, for example. Interesting thing to note. Marigny, one thing is interesting is, take notice, the crossbar you would expect would be up here, where I demarcated it. It's lower than expected. It gives a much more casual voice and tone because of that. And then combine that with, again, it has flaring out as well. It kind of flares out the ends and then tapers in the middle. In this case, it's much more controlled as a rounded sans serif structure overall. We can see that in all the terminals of the H. And besides the lower crossbar, it also has some flaring as well, kind of tapering the inside as well. And again, the C, so in the C, we can also see, again, this idea of like angularity. There's a certain angleness in Manu that we see across the board. Because notice the round is not as perfectly rounded shape. It's much more like imagine like a triangle. You know, almost you can see a triangle shape in this C versus the more elliptical nature of the Marigny C. And I think the inclusion of these serifs, very enclosing. They feel like they're closing in on the space compared to the general openness handled in the Marigny C. And it's interesting to note like this play with this. It gives a very enclosing, abrupt, jaggedy effect overall in voice compared to the smoother, gradual tone and treatment over the course of the Marigny C. And the E is, I think, a really interesting one because notice most of the other strokes, most of the other letter forms or components of the form in Manu have been very direct, meaning like this is one stroke, this is one stroke, this is one stroke. They feel it's a very clear delineation between the tool that made it and the path it went. These serif treatments at Manu feel different. They feel like a combination where there's this kind of like almost like two strokes were put together to make these serif treatments at the end. It's very interesting because we don't see it in the other aspects of the letter forms, but in this E it does. And it gives a very like, I'm trying to think of the best way to describe it. Very like Dutch feelings, very, very like Fleischmann kind of attitude with this kind of like fangy effect in the serif treatments in the E, for example, and how long this part of the serif treatment is in the crossbar of the E. It gives a very Fleischmann-esque kind of voice behind it. It doesn't feel very German-y, let's put it that way. Marigny, again, it's following the same model. You know, basically the terminals are these rounded terminals with kind of a pinching and then a tapering out to give this kind of softness and feel across the whole letter form. But it is interesting comparing just the two of them. Like there's a certain like jaggedness and like shakiness in the Manu edition, and Marigny is much more smoother, put together, stabilized. But also take notice too, there are some decisions like the lower crossbar of the E in Marigny. Again, it's mimicking the H. The H also had a lower crossbar. It gives it a much more juvenile, youthful feel behind it. While in proportion, notice how narrow Manu is compared to the wideness of the Marigny. Okay, so what can we include from all this? So notice that generally people yell about these handwriting fonts because it's like, if you wanted handwriting, you should do it yourself. We shouldn't let a font do it for you. I can understand that point, and I usually yell at my students about that. It can come off as lazy or lack of effort and intention to use a handwriting font. But I do think it is a interesting arena of exploration for type designers, because type design has this odd relationship to writing and calligraphy and form making. They all relate with each other in some way, in different degrees. So I chose to present these two different typefaces this week to show how this concept of handwriting, you can be very on the nose about it and be very direct, or much more subtle in your handling of it. Manu is much more direct. It feels scrawled. It has a certain abruptness, jangledness, irregularity to it that gives it, again, this feeling of handwriting, that the tool that drew it made it, and it's playing off that very directly. Marigny, it takes this idea of handwriting to mean kind of softness, delicateness, kind of tool making, like kind of a smooth transition of strokes to other strokes, with a certain kind of naivety or juvenileness, with like the lower crossbars, for example, and the long branching arching of letters like the N, the B, etc. So this has been Fontribute. I really hope you learned a lot about the tension of handwriting to typography and how different type designers can approach different concepts of it. I hope you learned a lot. This has been a great discussion with you. This is Thomas Jockin, and I look forward to talking to you next week. Take care. Bye.